Okay, Judges chapter 9. We're moving right along through Judges. Tonight we're going to look at Abimelech. Abimelech, if you remember last week, we finished up with Gideon. Gideon represents the judge who started strong, ended weak. Started good, ended bad. It had a lot of promise. Started out well, but he turned at the end. If you remember, God used him to defeat the Midianites with just him and 300. Of course, it was God who won the victory. But the victory went to Gideon's head. He got the big head. He crossed the boundary. Remember, he crossed the river. He should have never crossed the river. Once he crossed the river, that's when things went south for him. And if you remember, he just went on this massive killing spree. The people saw him as this great warrior. They wanted him to be king. Gideon's like, no, God needs to be king. God's still going to be king. But secretly, yeah, he wanted to be king. Matter of fact, Abimelech, who we're going to study tonight, his son, Abimelech means my father is king. So today we'll look at Abimelech. Of course, you know the cycle of Judges: disobedience, discipline, despair, deliverance. Just a continual cycle over and over. What is interesting about Abimelech is not a judge. It's just almost like a parenthetical story, a parenthesis in the midst. So scholars call Abimelech the anti-judge. So it's just the story of this rebel rouser who just wreaked havoc. There is a lesson. There is a lesson with the life of Abimelech. The end of chapter 8, here's how it ends. We didn't read it last week. Gideon dies. What do you think happened? What do you think happened with Israel after the judge died?
They just went right back.
They went right back to whatever they did. That's exactly right. Read the end of chapter 8. I mean, literally, I don't want to say you don't need to read it, but you already know. As soon as the judge dies, they bite the dust. They go right back to the Baals. Remember, Gideon tore down the Baals? Remember of his father? Well, they go back to serving Baal. So, chapter 9, verse 1. So one day Gideon's son Abimelech went to Shechem to visit his uncles, his mother's brothers. He said to them and to the rest of his mother's family, ask the leading citizens of Shechem whether they want to be ruled by all 70 of Gideon's sons or by one man. And remember that I am your own flesh and blood. If you remember from last week, Gideon had 70 sons. 70 sons from many different wives. Yes, that is a big wow. 70 sons. Oh my goodness.
Gosh, do you suppose he even could recognize all 70?
I don't know. So he had 70 sons from his many wives. He had one son from his concubine, his girlfriend, who lived in Shechem. That's Abimelech. Okay, so that's Abimelech. Abimelech is the one from the concubine. So he goes to Shechem. Shechem is significant. If you remember Genesis, the story of God and Abraham, Shechem is where God appears to Abraham and gave the promise. The land is going to be yours. The people is going to be yours. And so Shechem is synonymous with worship because that's where Abraham built an altar before the Lord. As a matter of fact, as soon as the Israelites, when they came into that land, they basically set Shechem up as a place to worship. So it's significant. And so it's not an irony. The sad thing is Abimelech, he's from Shechem, this place of worship, this significant place, but he's about to defile and destroy Shechem. And so he goes to his family. Basically, the first couple of verses, he's like, do you want 70 sons to rule, 70 guys, or do you just want one ruler? You want all of them, or you want me? So that's what he's wanting to become king. So it says in verse 3, Abimelech's uncles gave his message to all the citizens of Shechem on his behalf. And after listening to this proposal, the people of Shechem decided in favor of Abimelech because he was their relative. They gave him 70 silver coins from the temple of Baal-berith. That's Baals, the Baals that they worship, which he used to hire some reckless troublemakers who agreed to follow him. He went to his father's home at Ophrah, and there on one stone they killed all 70 of his half-brothers, the sons of Gideon. But the youngest brother, Jotham, escaped and hid. And so his campaign to be king is funded by evil, dark money, idolatrous money offered to idols. And to ensure he's the only ruler, what does he do? He assassinates his political rivals. He assassinates anyone who would dare threaten his throne. Every one of his brothers except Jotham escaped. When I read this, I can't help but see the dark money, the go after your political opponents. It reminds me of Washington, D.C. The dark money. I think of all the wicked money from these evil donors and all these lobbyists and these special interest groups. Most of the politicians in Washington, they're bought. They're bought and paid for by all these big pharma and all this evil, really World Economic Forum, one world demonic type stuff. And so what else do? They censor you. They cancel you. So it's just, one pastor said, he said it's different, same devil, different tactics. Same challenges, just different expressions. Actually, matter of fact, I'm in a doctorate class now in apologetics. It's the same challenge all the way back, but just different expressions. So it's the same thing here. So verse 6 says, Then all the leading citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo called a meeting under the oak beside the pillar at Shechem and made Abimelech their king. Now, in studying this, scholars believe this tree, this pillar, that this is the tree and pillar of Genesis 12:6, where God called Abraham. So, this is like a slap in the face. This is the place where God called Abraham, the place where he gave the promise. And so now this place, it's being desecrated by Abimelech. So Israel rejects God, rejects God's rule. They make Abimelech king. And of course, the results, it's disastrous results. And a matter of fact, most of this is just going to be reading the chapter because, it's a compelling story. But anyways, it says when Jotham, that's the brother who escaped, heard about this, he climbed to the top of Mount Gerizim. Mount Gerizim, you can visit Mount Gerizim. It's the Mount of Blessing. That's what Mount Gerizim is, the Mount of Blessing. So he climbed this Mount of Gerizim. He shouted, "Listen to me, citizens of Shechem. Listen to me if you want God to listen to you." So Abimelech means my father is king. Jotham means Yahweh is perfect. And so you've got the evil brother against the good brother. Abimelech is drawing people away from God, but Jotham is trying to bring the people back to God. So it's this tug of war. And so Jotham climbs to the top of Mount Gerizim, the Mount of Blessing, and he gives this weird parable. He shouts out this weird parable. So here's the parable. I'm just going to read it. So he says, "Once upon a time, the trees decide to choose a king. First, they said to the olive tree, 'Be our king.' But the olive tree refused, saying, 'Should I quit producing the olive oil that blesses both God and people just to wave back and forth over the trees?' Then they said to the fig tree, 'You be our king.' But the fig tree also refused, saying, should I quit producing my sweet fruit just to wave back and forth over the trees? Then they said to the grapevine, you be our king. But the grapevine also refused, saying, should I quit producing the wine that cheers both God and people just to wave back and forth over the trees? Basically, this parable is just showing the foolishness in choosing Abimelech. So he's using trees as an analogy. So then it says in verse 14, then all the trees, now see if you can figure this out. Then all the trees finally turned to the thorn bush and said, come, you be our king. And the thorn bush replied to the trees, if you truly want to make me your king, come and take shelter in my shade. If not, let fire come out from me and devour the cedars of Lebanon. Now you've got all these nice trees and the fig trees and the grapevines, but then you have the thorn bush. Thorn bushes were basically just scrub plants. They were useless. They were short. They were thorny. There's no shade. You know, the thorn bush says, I'll give you shade. Thorn bushes do not have shade. They were also easily flammable. They could easily be set on fire. What do you think the thorn bush represents? Abimelech. Abimelech, yeah. So think about the thorn bush thinks he can provide a covering even though he can't. He's thorny. Don't touch me or you will get pricked, you know. And then he's easily flammable. You mess with the thorn bush, the whole force is going to come down. You know what I'm saying? It's like, the point is this thorn bush, it's dangerous. It's unpredictable, just like Abimelech. So that's the parable. And so he says in verse 16, Jotham continued, now make sure you have acted honorably and in good faith by making Abimelech your king, and that you have done right by Gideon and all of his descendants. Have you treated him with the honor he deserves for all he accomplished? Talking about Gideon. For he fought for you and risked his life when he rescued you from the Midianites. But today you have revolted against my father and his descendants, killing his 70 sons on one stone. And you have chosen his slave woman's son, Abimelech, to be your king just because he is your relative. If you have acted honorably and in good faith toward Gideon and his descendants today, then you may find joy in Abimelech and he may find joy in you. But if you have not acted in good faith, then may fire come out from Abimelech, the thorn bush. May fire come out and devour the leading citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo, and may fire come out from the citizens of Shechem and Beth Millo and devour Abimelech. In other words, he's saying, I hope you made the right choice. Because if you didn't make the right choice, he's not only going to destroy himself, he's going to destroy it. Everything's going to come burning down. That's what he's saying. If you've made the wrong choice, and hey, it's just like choosing the president. We make the wrong choice, everything crumbles, right? So then it says in verse 21, okay, I'm just going to read a bunch of verses because there's really no explanation. Just let the word of God speak. Then Jotham escaped. So he gave that parable. And then it says in verse 21, then Jotham escaped and lived in Beer because he was afraid of his brother Abimelech, after Abimelech had ruled over Israel for 3 years. Okay, so the next couple of verses are crucial to the story. So after he had ruled over Israel for 3 years, God sent a spirit that stirred up trouble between Abimelech and the leading citizens of Shechem, and they revolted. The people who wanted him, God sent this spirit to cause trouble between the king and the voters, so to speak. So then it says God was punishing Abimelech for murdering Gideon's 70 sons and the citizens of Shechem for supporting him in this treachery of murdering his brothers. So this spirit was sent in to not only judge Abimelech, but to judge the people of Shechem for supporting Abimelech. Verse 25. The citizens of Shechem set an ambush for Abimelech on the hilltops and robbed everyone who passed that way. But someone warned Abimelech about their plot. One day Gaal, son of Ebed, moved to Shechem with his brothers. Gaal's another, insert Gaal, okay? Another integral figure. So Gaal moved in, and he gained the confidence of the leading citizens of Shechem. During the annual harvest festival at Shechem, held in the temple of the local god, the wine flowed freely. Everyone began cursing Abimelech. Who is Abimelech? Gaal shouted. He's not a true son of Shechem, so why should we be his servants? He's merely the son of Gideon, and this Zebul is merely his deputy. Serve the true sons of Hamor, the founder of Shechem. Why should we serve Abimelech? If I were in charge here, I would get rid of Abimelech. I would say to him, get some soldiers and come out and fight. So this newcomer comes in, and he wants to take out Abimelech. But when Zebul, the leader of the city, heard what Gaal was saying, he was furious. He sent messengers to Abimelech in Arumah, telling him, Gaal, son of Ebed, and his brothers have come to live in Shechem, and now they are inciting the city to rebel against you. Come by night with an army and hide out in the fields. In the morning, as soon as it is daylight, attack the city. When Gaal and those who are with him come out against you, you can do with them as you wish. So Abimelech and all his men went by night and split into 4 groups, stationing themselves around Shechem. Gaal was standing at the city gates when Abimelech and his army came out of hiding. When Gaal saw them, he said to Zebul, look, there are people coming down from the hilltops. Zebul replied, it's just the shadows on the hills that look like men. But again, Gaal said, no, people are coming down from the hills. And another group is coming down from the road past the diviner's oak. Then Zebul turned on him and asked, now where is that big mouth of yours? Wasn't it you that said, who is Abimelech? Why should we be his servants? The men you mocked are right outside the city. Go out and fight them. So Gaal led the leading citizens of Shechem into battle against Abimelech. But Abimelech chased him, and many of Shechem's men were wounded, fell along the road as they retreated to the city gate. Abimelech returned to Arumah, and Zebul drove Gaal and his brothers out of Shechem. So they tried to lead a revolt against Abimelech. Gaal had the gall to try to lead a revolt, but they failed. The next day, the people of Shechem went into the fields to battle. When Abimelech heard about it, he divided his men into 3 groups and set an ambush in the fields. When Abimelech saw the people coming out of the city, he and his men jumped up from their hiding places and attacked them. Abimelech and his group stormed the city gate to keep the men of Shechem from getting back in, while Abimelech's other 2 groups cut them down in the fields. The battle went all day before Abimelech finally captured the city. He killed the people, leveled the city, and scattered salt all over the ground. So he literally destroys his hometown, levels Shechem, this holy place, where Abraham worshipped. It's destroyed. Scattering of the salt for the farmers, that would mean something. You throw the salt to make sure they can't grow any crops. He's just like leveling it. This is a desolate, no more food. That means you can't rebuild. You can't grow crops here. So let's keep on reading. When the leading citizens who lived in the tower of Shechem heard what had happened, they ran and hid in the temple of Baal-berith. Someone reported to Abimelech that the citizens had gathered in the temple, so he led his forces to Mount Zalmon. He took an axe and chopped some branches from a tree, then put them on his shoulders. Quick, do as I have done, he told his men. So each of them cut down some branches, following Abimelech's example. They piled the branches against the walls of the temple and set them on fire. So all the people who had lived in the tower of Shechem died, about 1,000 men and women. That's horrendous. It kind of reminds me, it's not a good example, but have you seen the movie The Patriot? when they go into the church and the patriot soldiers, they burn, or the people come in and they burn the church down. So I mean, they're in this temple of Baal. 1,000 people are hiding, but he burns it down. So basically, what is the parable? The thorn bush easily catches on fire, burns everything. It's coming to pass. I mean, it's coming to pass. Fire is gone from the thorn bush, just like Jotham said. And the thorn bush has devoured, he said, it'll devour the cedars of Lebanon. And so, you would think after this, you've killed the people of your town, you've sought revenge, you've got revenge, you would think Abimelech would be content. I've destroyed the town. I've killed everybody in the town. You would think he would be content. He'd be satisfied. But he's not. He goes on another killing spree. Well, it's like Gideon. Remember Gideon? Gideon was vindictive towards the people that refused to give him food. So it's like father, like son. So look at verse 50. Then Abimelech attacked the town of Thebez and captured it. I mean, what is there to prove at this point, man? It just shows the evilness of his heart. But there was a strong tower inside the town, and all the men and women, the entire population, fled to it. They barricaded themselves in and climbed up to the roof of the tower. Abimelech followed them to attack the tower, but as he prepared to set fire to the entrance, a woman on the roof dropped a millstone that landed on Abimelech's head and crushed his skull. He had it coming. There's another story of a person who had his skull crushed with a tent peg, right? What is it with the skulls, right? He quickly said to his young armor bearer, "Draw your sword and kill me. Don't let it be said that a woman killed Abimelech." So the young man ran him through with his sword, and he died. I just love how these translators, so the young woman ran him through with his sword, as opposed to took the sword and ran it. So it all means the same. And he died. When Abimelech's men saw that he was dead, they disbanded and returned to their homes. It's like, all right, he's dead. I'm hungry. Let's go back. So it's like he's not. I mean, literally, there's nothing left. There's no cause for this. Here, verse 56. In this way, God punished Abimelech for the evil he had done against his father by murdering his 70 brothers. Verse 57, God also punished the men of Shechem for all their evil. So the curse of Jotham, son of Gideon, was fulfilled. It's an interesting story, isn't it? Who says the Bible is boring? Who says the Bible is boring, right? This is Judges. This is what life looks like when you kick God out. When you put man in place of God, this is what happens. It's just chaos. The man who set himself up as king was destroyed, as well as the people who rejected God and put him in power. When you're reading the story, it just looks like God has removed his hand. There's so much wickedness. There's so much killing and just senselessness and just stupidity. It's like God has removed his hand. But actually, God didn't remove his hand. God was still he was silent, but he wasn't absent, because God was still working. Remember verse 23 and 24? God sent the evil spirit to cause the division. So this wasn't just random. God sent that spirit to cause the division. And verses 56 to 57 confirms that everything they did, all the senseless fighting and killing, they thought they were doing it for their own honor, but actually it was God bringing judgment. That's what this is about. It's about God bringing judgment on them. And so I think this story is in here to show how God judges, how God brings judgment for rebellion. There's three observations that I've seen from this that I'd like to leave with you. Three observations, truths about God's judgment. Number one, God's judgment is sometimes unseen. And that's an interesting observation about this story, that God's judgment is sometimes unseen. The people were at war with each other. They didn't know that all along they were just pawns. God had his hand on their life, bringing judgment. They were being judgment. They didn't see the spirit that God sent. They didn't see the spirit that brought the division between the people of Shechem and Abimelech. So they thought they were defending their honor when they destroyed each other. But actually, it was God's judgment all along. God's judgment in the Bible comes in two forms. There's two types of judgment in the Bible. The first is the active judgment of God. The second is the passive judgment of God. Just like you have active and passive tense. Active judgment. Active judgment is when God judges in a way that can be seen, where you know it's from him. Noah's flood, that's the active judgment of God. God destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, fire and brimstone, that's the active judgment of God. At the very end, we spoke about the lake of fire. God casting the devil and demons into the lake of fire, that's the active judgment of God. The passive judgment of God is when we can't see it. We can't see it. Perfect example, Romans 1. Here's an example of the passive judgment of God. Romans 1 verse 24 says, so God abandoned them to do whatever their shameful things, their hearts desired. As a result, they did vile and degrading things with each other's bodies. So it says God abandoned them. In other words, God turned them over, released them to do whatever they wanted to do. So the judgment of Romans 1 is not that God actively poured out his wrath on these sinful people. It's that the judgment was that he let them do the vile things. So his wrath was not that he poured out judgment on those who did wicked things with each other's bodies. It was that he let them do the vile things to each other's bodies without any conscience, without any guilt. In other words, the passive judgment here is God basically let them destroy themselves. That's the passive judgment of God in Romans chapter 1. You could say it like this, he removed his hand and he said, okay, you do whatever you want to do. And what is sinful man going to what are they going to do when God removes his hand from their lives? They're going to destroy themselves. Passive judgment. He removes his hand. So we read, that's Romans 1:24. Look at Romans 1:26. That is why God abandoned them to their shameful desires. To give you the context of Romans 1, Paul is basically just laying out the case that all mankind is sinful. Remember that we did a whole study on the gospel. He's just saying everyone is sinful. All man is sinful. So he says that is why God abandoned them to their shameful desires. Even the women turned against the natural way to have sex and instead indulged in sex with each other. And the men, instead of having normal sexual relations with women, burned with lust for each other. And so basically, we are witnessing the passive judgment of God in our culture today. People, I've heard preachers say, God is going to bring judgment. No, judgment's already here. The judgment is that God is allowing people to do stuff that is contrary to his design and contrary to God is allowing them to do it without any conscience, without any guilt. That's the passive judgment of God. And when you think about it, this verse here, it speaks of homosexuality. But in our culture, we're way past homosexuality, aren't we? With transgenderism, pedophilia. Look at what's being promoted. Denigration of women, the genital mutilation of children. I mean, it's just, we're way past that. So judgment is here. The fact that our society pushes this agenda with no conscience is the passive judgment of God in action. And that's exactly what Paul is explaining here in Romans chapter 1. So number one, judgment is often unseen. Number two, God's judgment sometimes comes through people. See, here we see that God uses people to bring about his judgment. God used Abimelech to destroy the people of Shechem. He used the lady to destroy Abimelech. In the Old Testament, the Babylonians, God used the Babylonians to destroy Jerusalem. He used the Persians. In the New Testament, he used the Romans to judge Israel. So God often uses other people to bring judgment. Lastly, God's judgment ultimately comes because of rejecting him. It's a rejection of him. Shechem was destroyed because they rejected God. They weren't destroyed because they did sinful acts, because they sinned, because they whatever. It was simply because they rejected him. We do not want you as our king. Abimelech was destroyed because he rejected God. And ultimately, that's why God judges. Because we reject him. In the end, the final judgment of God, it's not because people sin. Our sin does not send us to hell. It's because people reject God. We reject Jesus. We reject the Savior. That's what ultimately brings the final judgment. So those are three observations in that long, messed up story. And it's not a good story, but this is a good story. It's a good story in the sense that we need to read it. And when we read a story like this, where it ends bad and it ends with judgment, we need to examine our own life, right? Are we rejecting God's rule in our life? Are we being rebellious? Are we testing God? Are we trying God by following evil, by following the ways of the world? If anything, the application from this is that we need to have a conscience that is sensitive to the Lord. You know, like the psalmist said, "Search me, O God, know my heart. Is there any wicked way in me?" We need to always be humble before the Lord. We need to be repentant before the Lord. And so, and of course, thank him daily for his grace. Because the reality is we all deserve judgment. All we like sheep have gone astray, right? Thank God for Jesus. Thank God for his grace. Jesus, our ultimate rescuer. Our ultimate rescuer. And so that will conclude the story of